Hello and welcome to this review and critique of episode 2 of the Fallout television series, which was recently released by Amazon Prime. However, be warned, because this commentary is going to be extremely spoilerific, both for the episode and the series as a whole. Anyhow, without further ado, let's get on with it. So we start out in this research facility that seems to be breeding dogs. And there's a sign on the wall that says any newborn pups that weigh less than 10 ounces have to be incinerated, which is a bit mean of them. But this chap here in the white coat, a character we come to know as Wilzig, finds that this puppy is just under 10 ounces, but decides to literally tip the scale and let them through. So we've already established like a bond between Wilzig and this little pup, which I suppose shows Wilzig as quite a sympathetic character. And the pup's name is CX404, but later on we discover that it's really dog meat, so I'll just refer to it as dog meat from now on. And we get a bit of a montage showing dog meat grow up. We're never quite certain what the dogs are being used for. I think the implication is that they're some sort of weapon, but we don't know. Anyway, Wilzig seems to be keeping an eye on the development of dog meat, and at one point, as you can see here, takes the opportunity to pick the dog up and walk out of the puppy facility. Outside now, and we see this guard with a very distinctive las rifle, and in the background there's someone on a gurney, and we get a brief glimpse of their hand, which is suspiciously green, something that Wilzig also takes notice of. And if you're at all familiar with Fallout, you'll know that the most likely explanation for this is that the figure under the sheets is in fact a super mutant. And eventually we get to Wilzig's private office, and there's a teddy bear on the desk, and Dogmeat and the teddy bear become quite friendly. Anyway, Wilzig gives the puppy a home, puts him on a treadmill for lots of exercise. I quite like the monitor in the back with its traditional Pip-Boy green text. So we're not sure what's going on in the lab, but there's lots of skeletons, lots of brains in jars, as you would expect from a mad scientist. And all we see really is Wilzig and the dog making friends for quite a long time. And we also discover that Wilzig has got this sort of private cave behind a desk. So there's a big hole in the wall, and this is where Dogmeat lives. But this is the life of Wilzig and the dog. Wilzig does his experiments and his research work, and Dogmeat takes his walkies on the treadmill. This blue object is quite crucial to the story. It's like a little glowing tablet in a jar. And for reasons best known to himself, Wilzig decides to inject this into his neck, which seems to be quite a dangerous and painful procedure. And unfortunately, this is one of these story twists that it looks quite interesting now, but once you see the final episode, you realise that none of this really makes sense. When I first saw Wilzig inject this into his neck, I thought this was a bit of biotech that would, interact with his brain in some way. I figured there was a very good reason why Wilzig was doing this. But it turns out there really isn't. And the only reason we see him inject something important into his neck is so that we can see various factions trying to get hold of his head later on in the series. It seems someone fell in love with the idea of people fighting over a head, and this was the only way they could think of actually, achieving that. But if they'd spent a few more minutes sort of establishing the situation, I think they could have found quite credible reasons why this was done. So for example, if we saw the security going in and out of this facility, this might involve some full body x-ray that missed out his head for whatever reason, but you could see him walking through an x-ray, being checked out, and perhaps a guard looking up his nose and in his mouth to make sure he wasn't smuggling anything in or out of the facility. And it might turn out that his neck is actually the only really convenient place to hide this damn thing. But as it is, this apparently quite interesting procedure is fairly nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's a bit irritating, and it's one of a series of things that on the face of it look quite reasonable when you first see it, but doesn't make any sense at all once you see later episodes. Now it's quite soon after the injection that we realise that Dogmeat is like an illegal dog. He's a contraband dog that Wilzig shouldn't actually have. And up till now, I just assumed that Wilzig had taken the dog as a pet, and that everyone knew about it. But this guy comes in, sees the dog, is quite shocked by the dog's presence, and hits the alarm. And I perhaps should have guessed that the dog shouldn't have been there because Wilzig was hiding it in his cave. But initially I thought Wilzig had got the dog to protect something in the cave, like security for things that he was stealing and hiding away. But it turns out that it's the dog that was the problem. And it's a little bit strange in that the dog has been there for quite a long time, and he's been on the treadmill every day it seems, and no one has noticed that Wilzig has got a dirty great dog in his office. I mean, I think it's quite extraordinary that no one has actually noticed this before. And how did this guy get in, really? I mean, did Wilzig forget to lock the door one day? Again, it's a bit of a surprise. Initially, I wasn't at all sure what this guy was worried about. I thought he saw the hole in the wall, and that's what triggered the reaction to launch the alarm. But no, it's the dog, it seems. Anyhow, Dogmeat goes a bit crazy, and more or less saves the day, but by ripping the guy's throat out. And it looks like Wilzig is perhaps a little bit disappointed by his pooch's behaviour. He looks quite forlorn. But I think it's more that he knows the game's up, and that he and Dogmeat are going to have to make a run for it. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I find it incredible that no one knew that he had the dog. Everyone saw him walk out with the dog. All the dogs are like, tattooed and numbered. And there's loads of people that would have seen him walking out of the facility holding a dog. You would have thought they'd be able to put two and two together, but it seems not. Here's Wilzig and Dogmeat making a run for it. Again, no one seems particularly interested in the fact that he has a dog, so you do wonder what all the fuss is about. There's some really nice interior shots like this of some decayed factory that look fantastic. I should have mentioned before now though, that I think these people are identified as working for the Enclave. And the Enclave is the name given to the remains of the US government in Fallout lore. And they're generally considered to be the bad guys. So this guy Wilzig is an Enclave scientist who's been up to no good. Outside he dumps all his ID, but he's then surprised by a machine gun turret, which are another staple of Fallout lore, very good for base defence. And I do like the little sign there that says please remain calm. And the turret then proceeds to let rip at the fleeing Wilzig and Dogmeat. And there's quite a few people who have ragged on this scene. And I wasn't too sure about this really. My view was that this old clunky machine gun might just not have been very good. But when you watch back the footage, it's quite clear that a lot of these bullets are just going straight through Wilzig and the dog without causing them any injury at all. If you look at all the squibs that are going off indicating where the shots are falling, most of them are behind these two, so there's no way at all they should have been able to get out of here. Yeah, I think they mistimed the run, but perhaps didn't have the time or the budget to do a reshoot. Although they could have fixed it in post I suppose, but didn't bother. Yeah, Wilzig and the dog are definitely getting shot here, but they make it by the skin of their teeth. And I think this is quite good. They do this at the beginning of most of the episodes. You'll have the Fallout symbol, and that will be like interacting with whatever was going on before. So in this case, you've got the bullets, and you see, a spray of bullets across the Fallout sign. Quite a nice artistic touch. And that is the prologue to episode 2. Cut to Lucy on the beach, which is where we left her in episode 1. And she's exploring the wasteland, not really sure of her next steps. But she finds this massive old boat in the desert and then heads to this ruined town, and we will see this town quite a lot. There are a lot of scenes set in ruined buildings in the series, and they all seem to feature these houses, so there's not a great deal of variety in the interiors. We tend to see the same set over and over again, but it's well done, so I don't care. It would be very interesting to know where this is though. Perhaps it's the workers' housing at some abandoned factory. If you've got sharp eyes in the bottom left, you'll see a very familiar silhouette. And a few moments later we see that hand belongs to an Assaultron, which I never spotted the first time round. I just thought it was a heap of rubbish. It was only when I was re-watching it for this video that I realised it was an Assaultron. And I would love to see a real working Assaultron in this series. Not this series, the next one. They're one of the most intimidating enemies in Fallout. So I'm not sure whether Lucy knows what it is, but she walks on to investigate a building. And I think they've done a really good job here, recreating a typical Fallout tableau. Everywhere you go in a Fallout game, you'll stumble across these houses looking for loot and treasure. And you'll normally find one of these rather pitiful vignettes of despair. So in this case, a group of skeletons gathered round a table, with a baby skeleton on the floor. and a big bottle of poison on the table, indicating that everyone's committed suicide rather than face life after the bomb. Yeah, skeletons at table are another Fallout staple. And this shot's quite nice. Again, I didn't see this the first time I watched it, but there's a single pearl earring stuck to the side of this skeleton's head, a rather affecting contrast. Anyhow, Lucy soon has enough of that and buggers off, and the next time we see her she's making camp somewhere. But after settling down, she's rudely awakened by the sound of a growling dog, and this turns out to be Dogmeat, who goes and attacks a rad roach. And I think what happens here is that the rad roach was creeping up on Lucy, going to take a bite out of her, but Dogmeat comes along to save the day, in which case it might have been better to actually see the rad roach creeping up on her to build up a little bit of tension, because before we know the rad roach is there, Dogmeat is already tearing it to pieces. And where you've got Dogmeat, you also get Wilzig, who's also sitting at the fire. A big problem I've got with Wilzig here is that he looks pristine, really. He looks like he's just stepped out of an air-conditioned office. We're not sure how long he's been on the run. When we saw him leave the Enclave, it was dusk and there was snow on the ground, so we had to presume he was up in the hills somewhere. It's quite possible that he's walked this distance in the same night, but it doesn't seem likely. But even if he'd only been walking for like 6 hours or something, I would expect him to look more careworn than he does. He looks like he just stepped out of his trailer, and he's so obviously perfect. I can't help but think that this was a deliberate design choice, so it's a bit baffling to me. Anyhow, Wilzig recognises Lucy as a vault dweller, and gives her a little bit of a speech about surviving on the surface, essentially telling her to go home because it's too dangerous up here. But Lucy's looking for her father, and she's not going to get put off. So Wilzig eventually leaves. Oh, the other thing that Wilzig does is warn Lucy about lighting fires in the open, saying that this will attract all sorts of unwelcome attention. But at the same time, he knows there must be people searching for him, and yet he chooses to sit next to the fire, which is quite a strange choice. I mean, there are people actively looking for him, and he ignores the very advice he's giving Lucy in the first place. In his shoes I would have smothered the fire straight away, but of course then you'd have to have this scene in complete darkness. So Wilzig departs, and we go back to the Brotherhood of Steel story, where we last left Maximus and Knight Titus in a vertibird, and they're heading out into the wilderness in search of Wilzig and Dogmeat, although they only know them as target and companion. Here's Maximus with his typical dozy expression, and he attempts to engage Knight Titus in conversation, but Knight Titus isn't having any of it, and he basically just tells Maximus to clean his crotch plate, which Maximus does. And this is the first example of the rather disdainful attitude Knight Titus shows towards Maximus. Yet it seems Knight Titus is not at all impressed with his new squire. However, you do get the idea that Knight Titus would be treating any squire with disdain. He doesn't seem to like them as a group. Now, the vertibird has been dispatched to a town called Philly, which we'll see later on. Philly is a big junk town out in the wasteland. But Knight Titus orders the vertibird to stop, because apparently he's bored and he wants to land so that he can go and shoot something. And Maximus suggests that this isn't a terribly good idea, but is typically ignored, and they decide to set down. Although the vertibird doesn't actually land, what they do is they get this winch out, attach Titus to it, and then he and Maximus are lowered to the ground, and it does seem a bit of waste of effort. You've got a perfectly nice bit of flat ground here. I don't understand why the vertibird just couldn't land and drop them off. Instead we've got this rather protracted exercise with a cable hoist, which does seem quite the waste of time. I can understand this if they were lowering into thick jungle, but since there is so much empty space there, why not just put the vertibird down? Yeah, the whole procedure seems to be more about spectacle rather than doing what would actually have been more practical to do in real life. And so the vertibird flies off back to the Brotherhood, and Maximus and Knight Titus are left in the middle of nowhere, and Maximus picks up his huge golf bag and chases after his knight. In the next scene we're back with Wilzig and the dog, and they've stumbled across an old quarry. Again, Wilzig looks like he's just stepped out of a trailer. There's not even sweat rings under his arms, and by this time you really would expect him to look quite travel worn. But once more, everything about him is perfect, and I really have no idea as to why they decided to present him like this. But it seems it's lunchtime, and Wilzig opens a can of cram, an iconic Fallout foodstuff, while Dogmeat goes and explores a cave, and a few moments later returns with a human hand, which understandably puts the willies up Wilzig. He looks around, sees various bones, and realises they must be, well, in or close to the lair of some kind of predator. So he decides to scarper PDQ. Back to the Brotherhood, and Knight Titus and Maximus are out of the wasteland and in a forest. Maximus struggling on behind, and they too come across the same quarry, which is quite the ridiculous coincidence when you think about it. They were on their way to Philly. Knight Titus, quite unprofessionally, decides that they're just going to get dropped down into the wilderness. They walk through the wilderness, enter a forest, and just happen to stumble across the same quarry that Wilzig and Dogmeat were at a few moments before. It looks roughly the same time of day. So this is a huge convenience injected in service of the plot, which is quite disappointing. I wish they'd found a more organic and believable way of setting this up. I mean, I can quite understand it if, the vertibird had been flying towards Philly and then they got a radio signal saying that they'd got new information and that they thought the target was in this location. That would have been quite easy to set up, and it would have offered a much better explanation, or at least more believable than stumbling across them by accident. Anyhow, Maximus does a little bit of detective work. He finds signs of a man and a dog and automatically assumes that it must be the target and the companion, although there must be lots of people wandering around in the company of dogs, but it's certainly enough evidence for them to investigate further. So they decide to look in the big cave. Initially, Knight Titus is happy to take the lead, but when it's a matter of going deeper into the cave, he decides that Maximus has to go ahead. And it's at this point that Maximus delivers quite a dumb line, really. He says, "I don't have any armour," which, he knows, Knight Titus knows, we can plainly see. So yes, it's quite understandable that he doesn't want to go into the cave, and it would make much more sense for Knight Titus to do the exploring. But I think he could have come up with a more apt observation than merely the fact that he doesn't have any armour. Yeah, it just seemed like a filler line that was waiting to be replaced by something better, but they never thought of anything. However, Knight Titus insists, so Maximus has to go inside. The twist being that the predator is actually standing behind Knight Titus, which is poetic justice, I suppose, and the predator happens to be a giant irradiated bear called a Yowie Gowie, I think. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but these are quite famous monsters from Fallout, extremely dangerous. Knight Titus does put up a little bit of a fight, but he loses his gun, has a bit of a fist fight with a bear, and then decides to run for it. Yet unfortunately, outside he trips over, bashes his head, and then the bear starts to maul him. Maximus rushes out to see if he can help, and after a slight delay, shoots the bear in the head with a 10mm pistol, which is an offence against law really, because in the game, if you tried to take down the Yowie Gowie with a 10mm gun, you'd see exactly where that got you. But no, 2 shots to the head finish off the bear, but Knight Titus is left injured on the ground. However, it's not clear why he's injured, because the bear doesn't tear off any of his armour. All the armour is intact as far as we can tell, but Knight Titus does appear to have life-threatening injuries, and immediately demands that Maximus get him a stim pack. Maximus tries to do what he's been asked to do, but Knight Titus keeps castigating him, telling Maximus that it's his fault that he's been injured, and that once the Brotherhood find out, they're essentially going to execute Maximus. They're going to hang him up by his lungs. Yeah, Knight Titus also spends quite a lot of time cursing the wasteland, complaining just how horrible it is, which does lead you to wonder why he insisted on being dropped in the wasteland in the first place. Like I said, they were originally going to Philly. So it's another example of a character not behaving in a very consistent way. Yes, something else about this scene is that Knight Titus keeps saying that he's under the bear. In fact, his exact words are, "Get this effing thing off me, got a 2-ton irradiated bear on my back." And he quite obviously doesn't have the bear on his back. In fact, Titus is using the bear like a big pillow. And I think what happened was that initially this scene was going to be written where Titus was trapped under the bear, and this was the reason he couldn't get his own stim pack. But for whatever reason, they couldn't have the bear on Titus. Perhaps there were logistical problems. Or perhaps they were thinking, well, how on earth would Maximus have been able to lever this huge bear off the knight to get to the armour? But in any event, they seem to have changed the setup, but didn't adapt the script to suit. You know, why they didn't change the dialogue to suit the situation, I have no idea. Perhaps there's rules about that, and unless there's a writer on the set, then they have to stick with the script, which would seem quite inflexible. Now Maximus has been taking in all these threats and has come to the realisation that if Knight Titus survives, then Maximus is going to get executed. So he gets his hand on a stim pack, but understandably doesn't go to help Knight Titus. Instead he just sits down and lets nature take its course, watching old Titus breathe his last. Back out in the desert, and we see this rather disreputable looking character attacking a large machine. And here's Lucy, and she's got her trank gun. She's saying hello to the gentleman, wanting some information. I do wonder why Lucy has got a trank gun though, because I'm sure she had lots of opportunities to pick up a better weapon in the vault. Certainly the other vault dwellers and the raiders that attacked them all had access to very good weapons. So I'm not sure why Lucy decided just to bring this weapon. It's possible that all the other weaponry was locked up in the armoury again, and this is the only gun she had access to. But it did strike me as odd that she didn't have a machine gun or something. And Lucy and this rather eccentric gentleman have a nice little chat, and this whole scene is essentially meant to be representative of the kind of random NPC encounters you might have in a game, and I think they do it quite well. This is quite a nice scene, this guy's quite funny, and he tells her that the town of Philly is just over the next hill, and this is where she might be able to find information about her missing father. Back with Maximus, and he's managed to dispose of Knight Titus. He's got into his undersuit, and then he climbs into the power armour, and the power armour looks really good. Unfortunately, once Maximus gets into the suit, we keep cutting back to his face inside, and it's a little bit distracting. When Maximus is inside the suit, I would much rather see everything from the outside. Constantly cutting back to his face is annoying. As I said in the video for episode 1, I don't think this guy is a great actor, and unfortunately a lot of his acting inside the suit just consists of pulling faces really. I mean, it's a bit unkind to say so, but that's essentially what it is. So bizarrely, and for reasons I don't fully understand, we go straight from Maximus in the forest to Maximus in the desert. We don't really have any idea of the geography or the scale of the wasteland, but you'd think the forest and the desert would be quite removed from each other, and I'm not sure what prompted Maximus to run all this way. Presumably he's heading to Philly, and again I'm going to assume that he knows roughly where that is. But even though Maximus must have spent some time running from the forest to the desert, he's still getting to grips with his suit. So he's like dancing around, punching the air. He picks up a rock, chucks it like a million miles, having a thoroughly exciting time, ending up by kicking a rock at a building, which essentially knocks the whole building down. So we've firmly established just how powerful this suit is and what you can do with it. As the building crumbles away in front of Maximus, he hears a commotion in the background and sees this large bearded man attacking this smaller guy. And Maximus, being a defender of the weak, goes to intervene and grabs the attacker by the hair. But we don't have any objection to this, so far so good. This guy looks like a bit of a bully. But I think Maximus is enjoying the experience a little bit too much. He comes across as being a little bit sadistic in this scene, and after the attacker gets roughed up a little, the other guy runs off, and we discover that the big guy was attacking the little guy because the little guy was having sex with his chickens, which leaves Maximus looking a little bit nonplussed. But we don't actually hear him apologise to the man with the chickens, which would have been a nice gesture. It's at this point that Maximus puts his arm up and seems to discover that flame is shooting out of his wrist. And I don't really understand this. Was this a surprise to Maximus? I mean, these flames become important later on, but the way Maximus behaves, it's as if he had no idea the suit could do this, which seems peculiar for someone who's grown up in the Brotherhood and must have seen these suits in action dozens of times. Here we are on the edge of the desert, and Lucy sees a sign to Philly, which apparently was a location in the game Fallout 3, which I confess I have not played. So she heads deeper into the woods and comes across a car graveyard, and I'm a little bit disappointed that we don't see any of the iconic Fallout vehicles. In fact, throughout the series, I don't think we see any of the traditional Fallout cars. All we see are old-fashioned American cars from the 40s and 50s. But it's here that Lucy starts to bump into people, and for some reason she's more friendly to these people than she was to the lone guy. Perhaps because this is an elderly couple, but she's not waving her gun in their face. And this is an example of an inconsistency that's quite common with Lucy going forwards. Closer to town, and there's hordes of people heading towards Philly. I'm quite surprised that more of the people she meets don't make more of the fact that she's a vault dweller, because they must know what a vault dweller is. And Lucy's outfit really stands out, so I would have expected more stares and pointing when Lucy appears on the screen. But the people she meets for the most part just ignore her. Anyhow, Lucy starts showing pictures of her dad to various people, hoping that someone might have seen him. No one's terribly responsive, however, so Lucy carries on and soon comes to the centre of the settlement, which is a rather impressive shanty town built out of junk. And it's in Philly that we get a new glimpse of a character we last saw at the end of the first episode, and this is the Hand of the Ghoul. So Lucy's exploring the town, and she happens to see a two-headed Brahmin. And in the same way that I would have expected the townspeople to show more interest in Lucy, I would have expected Lucy to be more affected by the sight of this two-headed cow walking down the street. I mean, to her eyes it must be quite horrifying, but she just sort of grins at it. But she seems quite blasé about it, which doesn't really ring true in my book. Something in a shop window catches Lucy's eye, and we see that it's a Pip-Boy. And we also cut away to see the Ghoul sitting in a chair, apparently staking out the middle of town. Lucy enters the store, sees a lot of Vault-Tec equipment lying around, and goes to speak to the owner, who is revealed to be a lady called Ma June, who runs an establishment called Ma's Rarities. And Lucy rather rudely points out that because Ma June's establishment is full of things that Lucy assumes are stolen, that Ma June must associate with criminals, in which case she might know the person who stole her father. An assertion that Ma June understandably takes offence at. Ma June, a very good character, one of my favourites in this series, looking very Fallout and weather-beaten. But as you might expect, Lucy gets short shrift, and when she happens to mention the name of Moldova, which is the name of the leader of the raider gang who kidnapped her father, Ma June gets very cold and quickly closes a ledger she'd been looking in, which suggests to Lucy that this ledger contains a secret. Following this exchange, Ma June tells Lucy to get the hell out of there, and Lucy complies, at which point we cut to outside the store, and we see the familiar figure of Wilzig and Dogmean walking into town. So as Lucy exits Ma June's shop, Wilzig and Dogmean are walking in, leading to a rather unexpected encounter. So Lucy is surprised to see Wilzig at all, and I think Wilzig is quite surprised that Lucy hasn't taken his advice and gone back to Vault 33. But they have a bit of a conversation, and Wilzig reveals that he knows quite a lot about the inner workings of Vault 33, which is a bit of a mystery that I don't think is ever resolved. Although we can assume that working for the Enclave, he must have had a lot of inside knowledge about each of the vaults in the area and how they worked. So perhaps it's not a huge mystery that he knows what he knows. And yet again, Wilzig looks absolutely perfect. No signs of travel or living rough, but he must have been walking for days at this point. I would have at least put some dust on his jacket and perhaps given him a bit of stubble, because right now it looks like he got dressed half an hour ago. Very strange artistic choice. Again, I'm sure the costume and makeup department didn't just forget to do this. This must have been a deliberate design choice, but what effect they were hoping to achieve, I'm not sure. Perhaps they were hoping to emphasise the strangeness of Wilzig. Ma June overhears the conversation and comes out, and it transpires that she's been waiting for Wilzig and knows his name, and she tells him to go inside the shop. However, they're immediately interrupted by the Ghoul, who approaches them from the other side of the street. So it seems that the Ghoul's reputation has preceded him, because everyone starts to make themselves scarce. And the Ghoul confronts Wilzig, saying that there's a bounty out for Wilzig, and the Ghoul is here to take him in. Ma June looks rather nonplussed at this, and I think this is the first time we see the Ghoul in sunlight, so this is the first time we properly see his face. Looking very handsome there, despite the lack of nose. So there's a slight on-pass until the Ghoul pulls out his gun and blows Wilzig's leg off, and I presume this is to stop him running away. but it does seem rather extreme. I mean, something like that could kill Wilzig, but in fairness, we don't know if the Ghoul's mission is to bring him in dead or alive. But down goes Wilzig. Lucy is incredibly shocked, as you might imagine, and Marjoon declares a bounty on the Ghoul, saying that she'll give a small fortune in caps to anyone who can take him down. And we see various people scuttling around and getting into position, but the Ghoul isn't fazed at all and just starts blasting away at people, taking down half a dozen or so would-be assassins. So most of the opposition is taken down pretty quickly, but there's still a few snipers hiding up in the high spots, and these start blasting at the Ghoul, and they hit him quite a few times in the body. But we now discover that the Ghoul appears to be invincible. He doesn't get shot in the head, which we assume would kill him outright, but he takes about 5 or 6 body shots. Now, while all this is going on, Lucy takes the opportunity to run back into the store and look at the inventory on the desk, and there she sees the name of Moldava, though we don't know what other details she manages to glean from it. But outside, the Ghoul is fighting back, and he manages to take down all the snipers. There's about 4 or 5 of them, splatting them all over the place. And then it's Marjoon's turn, but she only takes a shot to the knee. So now we've got all the would-be assassins dead. Wilzig is down, Marjoon is down, Lucy's inside the store, so it's time for Dogmeat to stand up and take over. Dogmeat attacks the Ghoul pulls a knife and apparently kills Dogmeat, which is quite an affecting moment because we do think the dog is dead. Inside the store, Lucy notices the gunfire has stopped and decides to intervene herself. Now she's got the tranquilizer gun and she looks at all the weaponry on the wall, but for whatever reason doesn't take any of it down. She just walks out with the tranq gun. So she has a polite word with the Ghoul. I think she would be a little bit more nervous at this point, seeing how the Ghoul has basically killed about 10 people. But she stands up to our noseless friend, and when he doesn't back down, she shoots him with the dart. Though predictably, the dart has no effect on the Ghoul whatsoever, and he makes a point of saying that the amount of drugs in the dart is a drop in the ocean compared to all the drugs that are circulating in his system, because we know that he's essentially kept alive by vast amounts of medication. So now it's the Ghoul's turn. He draws a bead on Lucy, but before he can shoot, we have the appearance of Maximus. Maximus appears on this bus and tells the Ghoul to back off, then floats down to the ground using the jets on his arms, because I'd originally thought the arm jets were flamethrowers, but they're not, they're like jet propulsion units, which is somewhat of a deviation from lore, because in the games if you want to fly around in power armour, you would have a jetpack on your back, and I suppose the jetpack would interfere with someone's ability to get in and out of power armour without additional assistance. Yeah, so you would need to get into the power armour, then have someone else put a jetpack on you. So I'm guessing they invented the arm jets just for the convenience of the plot. But it's not a terrible idea, it's sort of somewhat believable. So Maximus flies down, intervenes, and now the Ghoul and Maximus have a big fight. But this is another one of those moments where something looks quite good in the moment, but in later episodes we discover something that makes this fight look a little bit weird. In later episodes we discover that Cooper Howard, who is the man the Ghoul used to be, we discover Cooper was a soldier who wore power armour and knows about a weakness in the power armour's defence. Yeah, so I think it's in the final episode where we see the Ghoul take down about 6 guys in power armour, shooting them in a specific place on the chest where the armour is quite weak. But for whatever reason, he doesn't use this knowledge in this fight, which is never explained. It's quite a big plot hole really. Meanwhile, Lucy helps Wilzig inside to safety, where Marjoon tries to fix his leg. And to fix his leg, they use this horrible device from a company called Jim's Limbs. This horrible meat grinder thing that cuts away at the stump, and then they screw this robotic foot to the end. And it's kind of hilarious and horrifying at the same time. And I had thought that Jim's Limbs must be something from the games, but I've not been able to find any reference to it. So while all this has been happening, we've learnt that Wilzig is trying to find Moldava, this raider chief, and he'd come to Marjoon's shop for instructions on how to find Moldava's base. Now obviously he can't make it by himself anymore, not with his bad foot. Marjoon can't take him because her leg has been injured. There's no one else in town that Marjoon trusts apparently, and so Wilzig suggests that Lucy takes him. And at first Lucy objects, but then realises this is the perfect opportunity to find Moldava, the person who kidnapped her father, so she agrees to take him. Marjune programs Lucy's Pip-Boy with Moldaver's coordinates, finds Wilzig a crutch from somewhere, and then sends them out the back door. Meanwhile, out in the town, Maximus and the Ghoul are still battling it out. Now at this point, Maximus takes off, but then lands quite heavily on this wooden boardwalk. One of his boots goes through the planks, and he's apparently stuck, which on the face of it looks quite ridiculous. It's quite flimsy wood, and we've already established that the suit makes him incredibly powerful, so why he can't simply pull his foot out is not explained. It just looks a bit pathetic. I could understand it if the foot was caught between two pieces of metal, or he got some sort of cable wrap round it. But as it stands, he shouldn't have any trouble just kicking his way free. It all looks rather silly, and the Ghoul has a good laugh at his expense. And while Maximus is trapped by this flimsy firewood, the Ghoul comes up with a knife and slashes away at some of the cabling in Maximus's neck. Initially I thought he cut an air hose, but I think it's something else. Maximus eventually manages to pull himself free, but whatever damage the Ghoul has done has caused the suit to misbehave, and it goes a bit haywire, causing Maximus to fly all over the place uncontrollably. The suit crashes into various things and then takes off completely out of Philly. On the outskirts of town we see another familiar face. This is the chicken-loving character we met earlier, and he says that he's got loads of serums and potions that could help cure Wilzig's foot, and they presumably think he's some sort of snake oil salesman. Later on we discover that he does actually have serums that could have helped Wilzig out, but for the moment he's ignored. And Lucy and Wilzig make their limping escape as Maximus flies overhead. Sometime later, Maximus makes a rather dramatic descent, and back at Marjune's, the Ghoul goes into the store to try and find Wilzig. He sees the blood, he sees the Jim's Limbs box. Marjune is nowhere to be found, and the Ghoul is apparently a bit stumped because he has no idea where Wilzig has disappeared to. He comes out of the store looking a little bit bewildered, then spots Dogmeat lying on the ground, and we can hear Dogmeat panting, so there's still some life left in him. The Ghoul takes him inside, gives him a Stimpack, we presume, restoring Dogmeat to full health, and now the Ghoul can use the dog to track Wilzig, which is actually a pretty good idea. Yeah, and it was quite an effective fake out because I was convinced the dog had died. A little later we rejoin Lucy and Wilzig as they tramp through the desert, and they come across this crashed Chinese satellite, but it's obvious that Wilzig can't really go any further. Even with his Jim's Limbs foot, he's bleeding quite heavily, and he knows he won't be able to make it. So he tells Lucy that he's taken some cyanide, and that he'll be dead quite soon. But the only thing that Moldaver is really interested in is the thing that he's got in his neck. So if Lucy chops off his head and takes the head to Moldaver, she might be able to get her father using that as a bargaining chip. It's quite a funny little moment when Wilzig describes the cyanide. Apparently it was a Vault-Tec product called Plan D, and it tasted of bananas, and Wilzig was surprised it wasn't a better seller, which made me laugh. And as well as the cyanide, Wilzig also has a bone saw, which is another staple of Fallout loot that you can find in the game. Many's the time I've been into an old medical establishment and found a bone saw lying about. Lucy, quite understandably, is rather appalled at the idea of cutting off Wilzig's head, but then Wilzig dies, and Lucy realises that doing this is the only course of action left to her. So she fires up the bone saw, and off comes the head. And that's the end of episode 2. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Hope to see you again for the next episode, and until I do see you again, I shall say good night. Take it then. Cheerio.